entendu.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the stream. For those of you who weren't with me in the previous session about culture, my name is Younes. I'm the CFO at the family. So this is the third and final session for the First Time Founder Summit of today. We had a lot of real interesting topics, but bear with us because this one is going to be an absolute gem. I'm sure we're going to talk about traction. It's such a recurrent theme for first-time founders. It's the one objective that you have when you start a company, to gain traction. And this is what Bryant Chou is here to talk with us about today. So thanks a lot, Bryant, for being with us today. Bryant is the co-founder and CTO of Webflow. Webflow's one-liner is a visual way to build the web. I guess there's no better way to describe what you do. If you haven't tried building a website with Webflow, you should definitely try it. It's super easy. It's fun. We love what you do at the family. So we're big advocates. But getting back on the topic of traction, I will leave the floor to Bryant to talk about it. And then I'll be back in 20 minutes for a Q&A. So you can start in the audience. Please ask a lot of questions to Bryant. He's super knowledgeable about the topic, as you will see. And Bryant, here's to you.
Great. Thank you for having me, Ines, and hello, everyone. I'm guessing most people are in European time zones, CET, but I'm actually based here in San Francisco, where Webflow is based. We're actually a remote-first company, so we actually have employees everywhere, but we do have an office here in San Francisco where I live. And yeah, super excited to join everyone here today to talk about traction. So really quickly, what's Webflow? Already had a really nice introduction, but if you haven't checked it out already, we are a visual development platform to help you publish websites, bespoke design, professional websites for the web. So we are now probably around 400, close to 400 full-time employees now, around 200,000 active customers. We launched back in 2013. And I just looked this up, but we're actually doing about 11 billion page views a month now across our entire platform. So we're powering over 150,000 websites. It's still a smidgen of, let's say, WordPress, but I think, or I would like to think that we're well on our way to getting there. And traction is near and dear to my heart because it was slow going for the first year or so. So it actually took us around 16 months to get to 1 million of ARR. And as you can see, we were growing quite slow, for the first, 7-8 months. And we kept iterating, and as I'll get to later in the deck, we kept building our core products, and we focused on 5 things that I'll go over today to essentially help us get to where we are today. This is kind of a snapshot of where we're at last year, but the business is actually has continued to do quite well since then. So 5 things that I'll drop for everyone today and share with you all. And before you read 5 of these cells and start wondering what each one of them are, I figure I'll just jump right into it. So the first one, everyone talks about making sure you pick a really large market, right? And Mark Andreessen talks about how if you have a good enough team, a good enough product, but if your market is huge, you'll still build a great company. And I actually believe that's true, but one of the ways that I think about it is I don't necessarily pick a market, let's say CMS for Webflow, or social media, a social application for teenagers. But one of the ways I think about traction is that I actually think about movements. And what I mean by movement is that it's something that is undeniably true, something that is bound to grow, something that people will gravitate to or understand easily. So here are 3 movements that we picked for Webflow. And the way I thought about Webflow was that we are at the intersection of mobile, because back in 2013, responsive websites was a big thing. We're at the intersection of web, because we had this belief that web was still in very, very early innings, and that the website market is actually, even though it was 30 years old, the website market is still going to be massive. And the third pillar, the third movement that we picked was design. And we actually believe that designers specifically would have a much larger role in technology in this decade and beyond. So these were 3 of the movements that we built the foundations of Webflow's business on top of. And to give you another example, actually, there was another company that I started called Vungle, which is a video advertising company. And very similar themes, where we picked mobile, video, and advertising as the 3 movements that really helped us gain traction, and to really help us think about what product we wanted to build to attach to these movements. So that's the first one. The second one is going to be slightly controversial, but I'm calling it Marry Your Co-Founders. So these are my co-founders at Webflow. So Vlad, CEO, is in the middle, and Sergi here on the right. He is our design leader. And they're actually brothers. So that's a fun thing. So we actually joke internally that I'm the third brother. Doesn't really look like it, but honestly, you're going to be spending a lot of time with your co-founder. And the way I'm thinking about this particular point is that a co-founder relationship is really like a marriage. And you hear this advice a lot. So before you enter a marriage, there's a few things, a few points to consider. First question that I'd ask is, do you even want a co-founder? My answer to this is 99% of the time, especially for first-time founders, I would say yes. Main reasons for that is I actually think the entrepreneurship journey is extremely lonely if you're to go about it yourself. The type of mental fortitude that you'll need to go through the peaks and troughs of entrepreneurship, it'll really tax you. So I actually think, just from a mental standpoint, a mental support standpoint, having founders in your shoes that are living and breathing the same problems that you have is really important. Second question is, like, what do you want to look for in a co-founder? So the way I think about attributes of successful co-founder relationships are, do you want to index on a skill that you may not have? So let's say your co-founder is a brilliant business strategist. Well, that's great. But in the world of especially tech, you will likely need a co-founder that is going to index very high on technical skill set. And one of the biggest observations that I've made, especially with talking to a lot of YC companies and founders, is that if you don't have a technical co-founder, your chances of success are much, much lower. And the reason for that is that it's just very difficult to find, let's say, engineering leaders that will help you build V1, V2, V3 of your product without that type of buy-in. So ideally speaking, you have engineers in your co-founding team, maybe even a designer, because I actually think from a business standpoint, business skills are actually the easiest to learn out of all the skills that it takes to build a startup. Third question is, what's the ideal setup for co-founders? So I'm going to be a little controversial here and actually say that the way you think about equity for your co-founders will be extremely important. So I actually advocate for all companies to have equal splits with very, very minor differences in equities percentage differences for all your co-founders. So 33, 33, 33 if you have 3, or 50, 50 if you have 2. Why? Well, again, like I said, the co-founder journey, the founding journey is extremely taxing. You don't necessarily want to create a scenario where a co-founder feels like they don't have enough skin in the game, or that their role is slightly less than yours. And I think that's going to be really important, because the way I think about it is that you're not necessarily optimizing for equity when you're starting out, you're optimizing for success. So equity preservation is not necessarily something that I think a lot about at this stage. And by and large, co-founders have cliffs. So if something doesn't work out, you can find another co-founder by letting that co-founder go. And I think most scenarios, a one-year cliff for co-founders makes a lot of sense. Next topic, next point I'll make is when you're finding traction, something that I encourage a lot of entrepreneurs think about is the price, not just the product. In fact, thinking about the price before you actually thinking about the product. So I'll start with a simple analogy here. So this is an example that's actually in one of my favorite books called Monetizing Innovation. It was written by this partner at Simon-Kucher Partners. And in this book, he uses this analogy of 2 different car companies. On the left, you have Fiat, and they had this brand called Lancia. And they spent, back in 2007, 2008, tens of millions of dollars. They threw their best engineers, and essentially the mandate was, let's build the best possible car. And what those engineers did was, okay, let's source the most amazing magnesium wheels. Let's find the fastest shifting gearbox. Let's find the highest torque engine, the most horsepower. Let's think about the finest construction materials. And what they ended up building was a car similar to this. I actually don't know if this is the exact car, but I'm bringing it up as an example. They actually built a car that had all these bells and whistles, had all these features, had all this comfort, all these cup holders, but the car flopped commercially. They barely sold any of these cars. The reception was very poor, and it ended up being a huge failure for Fiat Chrysler. So on the right, we have a different car manufacturer and a different car. So this is the Porsche Cayenne. And the story of the Porsche and how they went about developing it is almost opposite than what Fiat did. So what Porsche did was, instead of going and asking their engineers to go and build the best possible SUV, what they did was they actually had researchers to interview customers, to actually ask their customers, what aspects of a vehicle do you actually value the most? And how much would you be willing to pay for it? So that very, very simple question helped them actually create the Porsche Cayenne, a Porsche that had enough horsepower, but not too much, a car that had enough ground clearance, a car that had enough cup holders, enough interior space, enough cargo space. And this actually turned the company around, this single car, where Porsche was actually losing a ton of money, but this now became such a huge profit driver for that entire car manufacturer. So a few things here. Why do you want to focus on the price? So it actually forces focus. So by thinking about how much your customers are going to pay for your product, you will prioritize the most important features for your product. And then there's this other question about, is it more important to generate revenue, or is it more important to have adoption for your product? Well, this really depends. So if you're building a B2B SaaS product and company, I think it's extremely important to focus on revenue. But if you're building a B2C company where you require the network effects, then you want to think more about adoption. So that's extremely simple answer for that. And then two very tactical things that I'll share with you today, which is how often should I talk to customers and how you should talk to customers. So if you are pre-launch, I believe it's pivotal to actually talk to your customers every single day. So what we did at Webflow is during our beta period, which was closed, every single day we'd be answering support tickets. Every single day we'd be getting on the phone and talking to potential customers to get that real-time feedback. And then even after we launched, the founders still answered 30, 40, 50 support tickets every single day until we got to a point where it was no longer feasible for us to actually. So I think it's extremely important that you're constantly talking to your potential customer base. And how do you want to talk to them about price? Well, you actually ask one question. So you could actually ask them, how much would you be willing to pay for this product? Or another way of thinking about price is this question for number two, which is more aligned with product market fit, which is you want to ask them, how disappointed will you be if the product didn't exist? Another proxy for how valuable your product could be. So I actually find founders that have the rigor of talking to their customers every day and asking either these two questions or variants of this question to be quite successful. The last one is hack day is every day. So that's my sort of way of thinking about startups, which is that speed is really the only advantage that a startup has. So I think of every day as D-Day. And I don't know if that's like good for stress levels, especially at my age. But for a lot of young founders out there, this is the mentality that I would encourage. So these are the three questions that I would be thinking through every single day, which is what is the most important thing to accomplish? What distracted me actually yesterday that prevented me from accomplishing what I wanted to accomplish? And the third one is, what is the minimal marketable product that I have and how close am I to it? And constantly, the sort of principle behind this is that you constantly want to bias towards action. So that's the fourth one, which is hack days every day. The fifth one here is, I don't know how many people have read Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why, but I actually think that this is one of the most important aspects to have enduring traction in your company. So I'll share a quick anecdote here. So for those that may have not have read this book called Endurance, this is a book that detailed Shackleton's voyage to the South Pole. And it talked about how in this 8-month journey, they got shipwrecked, and essentially they had 8 months of darkness walking around in the ice, trying to figure out how they were going to get saved. And they're hunting seals, they're trudging for hundreds of miles over the ice. And actually, eventually, not a single crew member died. There wasn't a mutiny, and they all got home safe. And the reason why I think Shackleton manage such an incredible outcome from such a disastrous expedition was that he actually posted in his advertisement for this expedition this exact quote: "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success." And this is the line that Shackleton used to recruit people. And he started with why. He started with why go on this journey? What are you going to run into? And what happened was he just recruited some of the most hardened sailors that were in for an adventure. And he managed to build a crew that was able to sustain the long winter. So a few points here that I'll just share quickly. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So one of the examples here that I'll share is that Webflow wants to turn you into a unicorn. By that, I mean a designer and a developer. And that's why you're not buying another website builder. Second one here is hire for mission fit. And what I mean here is that you really want to be finding employees that are joining your company for the core reason that your company exists. And one of the examples that we have here is our first employee, Dan. He actually joined the company precisely because he wanted to make other unicorns by having customers use Webflow. And he believed in that journey so much that he actually would spend time thinking about what additional features that he could add to Webflow to really think about how to make designers unicorns. So one of the features that he actually came up with completely on his own was this feature called Webflow interactions, which is really cool. The third one is that I find that it's easiest for entrepreneurs to solve your own pain points, right? So solving for pain points that you have uniquely experienced. So my last company was advertising, and it just didn't resonate with me. But then when I partnered up with Sergi and Vlad on Webflow, this was a very unique pain point for me because I've always wanted to build websites without actually coding them. And that unique pain point translated into us building a product that was uniquely unique, but also it solved for a need that I had. And it made it much easier for myself to resonate with the customers. So I always ask entrepreneurs that I work with that, hey, do you actually have this pain point? How can you identify with this problem that you're solving? Because I always find that it's much easier finding traction solving for a customer where you're the ideal customer, number one. So that's it. 5 steps that I'll share with you. 5 things that I've always thought about in my entrepreneur journey. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bryant. It was super insightful. I learned a lot of things, and I love those golden nuggets that you shared with us. I actually didn't know about that story with Fiat and Porsche. It's super interesting, and I like how you take a spin on general startup, on classic startup ideas, but you add some more thought into it. Like, for instance, I really liked how you talk about customer-centric innovation, but also embed pricing within that, because that's going to get you to a much better understanding of your customers and how you can price the product, and from there gain tractions. We had a few questions come in. The first one is not exactly on traction. It's more about you personally as a technical co-founder. So you're the CEO of the company. You're also involved in go-to-market, but how your role as a technical leader also encompasses that mission of working on go-to-market?
Yeah, good question. I get that a lot. So for me, I've always liked building things. So my journey as an entrepreneur has always been about being an engineer first. I'm the kind of person that also wants to know how to do, if I have an idea, I want to know how to actually do it and implement it. So I think it was actually really important for me to learn how to do web app development, to get the necessary skills for me to be successful in a cloud-first environment and in SaaS. So that's where I started. So as a CTO of Ungle, as a CTO of Webflow, I thought it was really important to have that skill set. But then as the business matures and as it transitions, I actually found that I was just very naturally drawn to the strategy and the growth side of the business. And that's also just where we simply had a need. I just happened to be the one that was most interested in go-to-market. I also just happened to be the one that was most interested in driving growth, customer growth, subscription growth, and revenue growth for the company. So I think it was just a natural evolution of my journey as a co-founder and as an entrepreneur, where I would do exactly what I said in the hack day is every day, which is what is the most important thing that I need to accomplish today. So for the first 4 years of the company, it was building the product and building the engineering team. but for the last couple of years, it's been building the go-to-market motions. So it's essentially a translation of what I've been doing my entire time, but the scope has increased a little bit.
Yeah, I can see that. We had another question. So we had some people who are not non-technical, but still are founders of companies, and they were wondering whether, because you said that it's much easier to learn the business skills, but should they find technical co-founders or should they learn technical skills?
This is purely up to you. I always think that the only other thing that's harder or just as hard as building a company is becoming a very strong product or engineering thinker. You don't have to do both. You don't have to become a very strong product thinker and an engineering thinker, but you should at least have a very good sense for what makes a great product. So look at any single huge transformational tech company in the past 4 decades. Intel, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Snowflake, like every single one of these companies had extremely strong technical foundations at the co-founder level. You had Steve Wozniak, you had Bill Gates, you had Mark Zuckerberg, you had the 2 co-founders and co-CTOs at Snowflake. Like every single company that's in tech has a strong technical foundation in the co-founding team. So I'm not even speaking to like my own bias, but just like looking at the track record out there is that if you're building a technology company or technology as the root, then you definitely should have a technical co-founder on your team. The only other instance where it doesn't necessarily seem as important is that if you're building a marketplace business, if you're building like a social media app or something like that, where you can build Hangouts or Clubhouse, for example, with no engineering as on your co-founding team, because like there's simply so many off-the-shelf tools nowadays that you could just go hire a firm to go build it for you. But what you still need is you need a really strong product sense. So Evan Spiegel from Snapchat, one of the smartest product people out there. Even the Clubhouse founders, just like a really, really strong product sense. So if you're not going to learn how to code, you at least should have a really strong opinion on what makes a great product.
Mm-hmm. And you're powering a lot of people who build e-commerce websites who are non-technical, but they actually build great businesses. So yeah, this can definitely relate to that. Another question that we had was, what about your team? What's the backstory of the Webflow founding team? How did you guys meet and how did it get started?
Yeah, so I actually met Vlad my first job out of school at Intuit. So Intuit makes software that we use in the US, like QuickBooks, TurboTax, things like that. And yeah, I've known him for 13 years, which is crazy to think about. But not just Vlad, but I've also met some of my most important professional contacts from that job as well. And that's actually something that I didn't share today, which is having that strong professional network, either be it, another tech company that you worked at, or, something like the family where you have this cohort of other professionals that are on a similar journey to you, is extremely important and helpful in an entrepreneur journey, because that's actually a social backstop that you can draw from, you can recruit from, you can get advice from. So, I met my co-founder, my most important, business contacts, I suppose, my first job out of school. But then I also met some of the most influential professionals from that job as well.
Oh, that's really interesting. And yeah, definitely, I would agree with that. Like, the stronger the network you can maintain, the more opportunities you will have down the line. So that's definitely something that I agree with. Another question that we had for technical founders is like, you often are mesmerized by the own beauty of what you're building, but how do you refrain from nerding out on tech, and how do you actually apply this hacker mindset?
So I'm definitely not a technologist that gets lost in the beauty of technology. I get lost in the practicality of technology.
Okay.
So I actually think that's a very important thing to screen for if you're looking for a technical co-founder, is that if you're going to find, let's say, an engineer that's going to geek out about functional programming and how to write something super elegantly, and design it in a way that your customers will never experience the impact of it, it's not going to be a good fit. Because again, I strongly believe that speed is your only advantage as a startup. And if you can't execute well and execute quickly, it doesn't freaking matter how beautiful your code is or how beautiful your stack is. So, I mean, that's my point of view, and I obviously have experienced that as we grow our tech team, there are going to be engineers that nerd out from the beauty of technology or programming languages, but it's something that you can introduce into your company's engineering culture at the right time.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, another question that we had was, so you maintain the hacker mindset all the time, but are there any situations when you need to stop hacking, like when going as fast as you can is not the right move?
Definitely. I would say culture. I would say hiring. I would say anything that is one-way doors. So by one-way doors, I mean it's extremely difficult for you to walk back those decisions. There's a lot of things that are two-way doors in a company. Merging a pull request, you can click revert. Rolling back a deploy, you can click roll back. There's certain things that you cannot easily roll back. Those things are hiring. Hiring sets your culture. Once you set your culture, it's extremely difficult to change it. And it becomes extremely taxing on an organization as well. So those are things that I definitely think is not something that you just go biased towards action and just go solve willy-nilly. You have to be really intentional and thoughtful about things like culture.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. One thing that I mentioned a lot to early stage founders is also think about your equity story in the cap table, because it's the same. It's a one-way door, something that you cannot revert. But culture, we had a great session just before, and I definitely agree with that as well. I want to come back on your very first point, which was picking not the right markets, but the right movements. Is it a skill? How do you spot that? Like, can you train that skill?
Yeah, I'll give you what I do to create my sense or mental mapping for how I think about market movements. So there's small ones, there's also large ones. So large ones could be crypto, for example. There's small ones that could be like new database technologies or new programming languages, for example. So I have gotten decently good at extracting 80% of the information from an online article. So let's say, but the key thing is that you have to have a really strong directory of information. So where I go is, because I'm still an engineer and technologist, I focus a lot on reading Hacker News every day. But what I'll do is I'll skim headlines, and for interesting articles, I'll spend at most 25 seconds reading them to just pick up like what's happening in the market. Other things that I'll also pick up on, sources of information that I'll read, is Crunchbase. Crunchbase is his daily digest, is really, really good. I've also become quite addicted to certain daily newsletters that arrive in my inbox. So the Hustle daily newsletter is something that I read every day. And those are just things that give you signal on the market, right? They give you signal on just like how interesting NFTs are, how interesting whatever app that is hot are. So for me, like I'm also just constantly observing these things, and I'm trying to put a mental picture in my head for what markets are moving and what are interesting, which ones are fads, which ones are actually worth double clicking into. The one for me personally that I've totally written off is actually crypto, because I feel like it's so nuanced and that it's so difficult to truly understand what's actually going on behind a particular crypto project that it's just too distracting actually for me. So that's just hopefully where I can have some friends that can help fill in the gaps.
Yeah, this sounds like a great routine that you have to actually go and look every day at these articles and do your mapping. Another, perhaps the last question that we have, because I know that you need to leave us in a few minutes, is about investors and especially when we are talking about traction, like what's the impact that they're going to have on that traction, but also how do you select them to, and how much power do you give them to have an input in your company?
I think the easiest thing to do here is just go by reputation. You try to find other entrepreneurs that have raised from them. In YC, we actually have an investor database. So we actually can look up the essentially upvotes and downvotes for every single investor that has ever taken equity stakes in a YC company. So tens of thousands of data points there. So I think as an investor, the only social capital that is actually the most important social capital that you have is your reputation. So I think that's by far the easiest thing to lean on. With regards to power, I think nowadays, it's such a different story than in 2013 because everyone's raising from the same paper. They're all raising from safe notes. They're all, mostly have the same cookie cutter info rights, pro rata rights, and those are things that are very vanilla. In 2013 and 2009, like the paper that was out there, liquidity preferences, warrants, interest rates on your debts, you just don't see that anymore. So there really isn't that much holding back entrepreneurs that I see in the Silicon Valley. I do know in Europe it is a different game, and that investors are not nearly as adept or as comfortable with certain provisions. So another really easy thing that you could do is just move to Silicon Valley. You could instantly 3x your multiples and get very, very clean terms.
Yeah, that's true. But we're catching up though. But I definitely agree with what you said. Do your due diligence is the best. That's what you think about it. Well, okay. Thanks a lot, Bryant, for being with us today. It was super valuable. We had tons of insight from you, so that's great. And yeah, it was an amazing session. I'm sure a lot of the founders will find it useful to gain traction. And thanks for sharing all of that with us. Thank you for watching if you're watching later than the event. And yeah, take care.
Bye, everyone.